Hello, and welcome to my video on Duelyst Deck Building 101, Part 1 Fundamentals in Beginner Duelyst. The focus on this video will be on people who have not necessarily ever really played Duelyst much, or have just only started, or just people who in general want to learn how to build decks. So, if you're one of those people, then watch this. Now, fundamentals, right? So, Duelyst is a game where you have a 40 card deck, 39 cards, and then you have your general card, which isn't technically part of your deck, but you do add it to your deck as a part of your deck of 40. You can play up to 3 copies of any card, regardless of the rarity of the card. Unlike in, say, Hearthstone, where legendaries are restricted to 1 per deck. You have 3 card types: minions, spells, and artifacts. Minions are the card type that you play on the board to create board presence, and I will elaborate on that later in the video. Then you have your spells, which are the non-minion card type, which do various things depending on the card. Spells are faction specific and probably won't be really covered in this guide, but I will probably have a few spells in some example decks, and I'll explain them then. Artifacts are the card types that you equip to your general to give them stats or various abilities. Generally, it's their equipment, basically, that you give your general to make them more powerful, or to give them the ability to do things that they ordinarily would not be able to do. Now, an important part about deck building, since this isn't technically a guide to teach you how to play, but this is still very important, is to recognize that the player who plays first starts with 2 crystals, and the player who plays second starts with 3 crystals, and will have access to the mana tile in front of them on the first turn. And with that in mind, it is really important to recognize that, because of that, 1-drops aren't as integral to stuff like aggro decks necessarily. They're still important because they help you curve out, and usually they have various abilities and such, but it's not so important to have to draw, say, a 1-drop on your first turn because you start with 2 crystals or 3 crystals. There are 6 factions in the game. They're basically the different teams that you can pick to basically build your decks, and they give you access to specific cards that are exclusive to that faction. You have Linar, Songhai, Vitruvian, Abyssian, Magmar, and Vanar. Each faction has 2 generals, one you unlock at level 1, and one at level 11. Now, to be more specific, to unlock the generals, you start with Linar, and you start with Argeon. To unlock the other generals, you have to beat them in either practice or the ladder. And once you beat those generals, you get access to those factions to play them. And then, subsequently, you have to grind those specific factions up to level 11 to unlock their alternative generals. And then the important thing to recognize is the difference between these generals is that they each have a unique ability called a Bloodborne spell, which can be cast on the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and every turn after you hit 9 crystals. Now, with that said, it's important to recognize what type of deck you want to make. Depending on playstyle, depending on what card you have access to, Actually, it's more importantly is actually what cards you have access to, because some deck types may not actually be possible depending on what cards you have, especially if you're only starting out. It's possible. You have aggro decks, control decks, tempo mid-range, and you have combo decks. And sometimes some deck types are sort of interchangeable depending on the cards that they play. Sometimes like you will have a deck that plays like an aggro and a control deck based on the types of cards it plays. Also, typically how these are typically defined is how they often curve out and the type of cards they play. So, with that in mind, aggro decks typically very low curve, and they're very, very fast decks. They try to drop their hands very aggressively in order to create board presence and to control the game from the start all the way to the finish when they draw their finishers, basically. The control deck, typically slower deck, they don't drop as many minions, but their minions are typically better, and the spells that they use are typically more of an emphasis on removal or other miscellaneous tools like draw or search in order to acquire more resources. And then you have your tempo mid-range, which happens to be in the middle, where it tries to have a bit of both, where it's sort of like a higher curved aggro deck, where the emphasis isn't to literally drop everything that you can, but you want to get a middle ground where you get some decent value out of your middle cost minions, roughly. And then combo decks are the odd one, where you try to generally play where the emphasis is on playing combination of cards in order to basically execute really explosive strategies. Like the Mechazor deck. I won't talk about it in this video, but Mechazor is that archetype where you play a bunch of mechs and they create one big giant mech guy that you place wherever you want, and he'll basically be your win condition. Card archetypes. What the roles of individual cards are is important to recognize, because that's like to recognize what types of cards they are is to figure out what you want in your deck. Like when you choose to play an aggro deck, you want lots of cards that generate tons of tempo, cards that basically control the board by being there and then denying your opponent's tempo. Typically. Well, also the fact that Duelyst is a tempo-oriented game, so it's kind of a given, but like there are cards that do emphasize tempo harder than others. I'll show some examples in the next few slides. And then you have removal and control, where you manipulate or remove your opponent's. Those are the cards that manipulate or remove your opponent's board presence, typically. And when I say that, I mean I'm talking about their primary function, like the emphasis on what they are used for. Like, for example, there's a card like Dark Transformation, which is a Abyssian spell. Is essentially a removal card because it destroys any minion on the board and then creates a Wraithling in its place, thus denying your opponent's tempo and actually generating your tempo for you, allowing you to work off of that Wraithling. And then you have Burn. Burn is primarily used to win the game, essentially. You're using it typically to lower the enemy general's life much as you can. Typically, that's what it's primarily for. Oftentimes, you'll see that burn can be used as removal and control. That's just the inherent nature of how burn is. But typically, like burn cards, the whole point of them is to be able to hit face, to hit the general, and do damage. And then you have engine combination combination cards. Basically, cards you play in combination with other cards, because they generally either don't work as well on their own, or you want to, or you need to play them with other cards in order for them to actually function. Typically, you'll have a lot of spells that are used to buff creatures to make them more powerful or give them additional abilities. And engine cards are typically like draw cards or like search cards that get you specific cards to add to your hand in order to help you execute your strategy. So these are good examples of tempo cards, because generally they help you generate tempo by being on the board, but then they also help maintain it because of their generally either sticky nature or their ability to generate more tempo by making more guys. Slither Elder specifically, he basically just makes copies of himself. Pretty strong, you know. Looking at removal and control, you'll see they're pretty straightforward. Cards like Ritual Banishing, they just Entropic Decay, they exist specifically to destroy minions. Pretty straight and simple. Then you have cards like Sunbloom. The idea of silence. Silence is sort of like a pseudo removal, where the creature isn't necessarily destroyed, but it neuters their effectiveness. Like if you look back at the tempo slide, you'll notice that like all those abilities, if you dispel them, they just become their stats. They don't have any extra abilities. They are just the raw minion, which lessens their effectiveness significantly. Sometimes all you need really is a silence. Except in case of like Slither Elder, where the body is really big, and silencing it doesn't really deal with the problem necessarily, but it makes it so he can't reproduce, which is important. Okay. Then you have burn. As I explained before, burn can be used multiple ways, but their primary function typically is to hurt your opponent. Hurt your opponent where it hurts. You know, hitting the general, dealing the direct damage that you need in order to win the game. Typically, they're sometimes saved as finishers, or you conserve them as ways to just top off damage against minions because of how minions accumulate damage. So you can essentially just push them over the edge and kill them. Then you have engine combination cards. Engine and combination cards are very interesting because they're the cards that essentially add the spice to your deck. Otherwise, it would be very, very straightforward, minions fighting minions type of game. But these are the cards that essentially add a bit of the variance, and also add potential deck possibilities. Like Flash Reincarnation enables you to be able to cheat out creatures faster at a cost of some health, which is very powerful. You have Heaven's Eclipse, which allows you to draw 3 spell cards from your deck, which is also very powerful. Very, very integral to the Songhai faction, which does heavily emphasize spell use. And then you have cards like Time Maelstrom, which are unique and enables a specific deck type. Artifact Vitruvian, because it allows you to essentially get 2 attacks with your artifacts. Or sorry, more specifically, 2 attacks with the general, which typically you load up with artifacts, so then your general is super badass, lots of damage. And it allows you to basically nuke your opponent down with 2 swift attacks. Now to go over net decking. Oops. To go over net decking really quickly. This isn't a net decking video. But I will go over the fact that, like, you know, I will say that it's not necessarily wrong to net deck. You know, people use Mana Glow in Reddit. Like, I also use Mana Glow in Reddit just to do research to see what people build. But ultimately, you want to know how to be able to build your own stuff, because it is really useful. The problem with stuff like net decking is by net decking, everyone knows what you're playing. And the other thing is that with net decking, like, besides the fact that it's predictable, oftentimes sometimes these decks are really expensive. They're hard to build at the start. A lot of people can't build them. It's just expensive. And if you ever played a game like Hearthstone, like, when you're given an expensive net deck, it's like unrealistic to build unless you play for months and months and months. Duelyst is not as unforgiving, but it's still very costly to basically nuke all your cards, build a deck, and then commit to something heavily, and then they nerf it or something. That sucks. The feeling is bad. So I'll try to teach you how not only to build stuff sort of from, like, scraps to, like, build stuff cheaply, but also just to teach you the general idea of, like, what you can do with what you have, and how you can slowly work up to something like, say, a net deck, or what your idea is, like how to bring it to fruition. This is just the general process. Building, like, to build a deck, pretty much you look at your cards, you think of all the stuff that I mentioned before, basically. You know, you pick your general, you think of the objective of your deck. Like, how do you want to get, what is your win condition? How do you get to the point where you beat your opponent's general into the ground? You know, and then you look over the various card archetypes that you have available, and you see how those cards will get you to your goal, basically, you know? And then you test it. You can test it against in practice if you want. They're not necessarily very good, because by fighting the practice bots, their decks aren't very good, so they might not provide much challenge, but you can use them always as, like, a baseline to determine if the deck's even playable, you know? Ultimately, you'll end up having to go to ladder to test it to see if it actually is a practical deck. Then, you know, you win some games, lose some games. You then review those games. You see maybe you made some mistakes. Maybe the deck is viable. You see what cards work, what doesn't. Most importantly, as well, you see what type of decks and what kind of cards you're playing against, and then you decide what you need to have in your deck in order to fight those decks. Because ultimately, like, decks aren't exactly refined in a vacuum. You basically have to play against stuff to determine how to make your deck better and how to make it more effective against what you're playing against, you know, the metagame. And the whole point of this video, anyways, is to teach you, you know, the ability to adapt your building and how to, I guess, like, move forward. Sometimes you get in a rut, but, you know, That's where you really need to review your decks and then figure out what you can do to change them to make them better, or maybe just improve yourself, But it doesn't hurt to always look over your decks to see how you could change them to give you that edge, because sometimes it really is maybe like 1 or 2 card difference. And here's an example deck. Like this deck here, I made with literally just the basic commons. As you can see, the spirit cost is literally 0. There's nothing that can cost us. Anyone can make this deck. You can make this deck no matter how much you played Duelyst. You probably wouldn't want to build this deck if you have cards. Probably because it's not that good. But this is probably sort of the best you can kind of do with what you have if you don't have very much. And you may not need to know exactly what all these cards are, because some of these will be covered in the video, but the whole idea is that this is essentially a tempo deck. Well, it's like a tempo aggro deck. It's a little curved down. If you want, you can always curve it up by adding some more higher cost minions, but like the starter higher cost minions kind of taper off around Primus Shield Master. He happens to be probably like one of the best like commons, I think. Well, sorry, one of the best free commons that you get at the very start. Oh, yeah. Since I am using Liner as the base. I guess to explain, you have the hands, which are basically Divine Bond. Divine Bond is a really, really good free spell. It'll basically be your win condition probably, because the whole niche of playing Liner and Archeon is to basically tempo out and then push your opponent into a corner and then finish them with Divine Bond, because Divine Bond adds a minion's health to their attack, which you could imagine when you have a lot of minions with a lot of health, that's a lot of attack, And then you have Tempest, which I think you unlock that at level 10, technically, so maybe you might not actually have it at this exact point when you watch the video, but chances are if you have it, you can play it, and Tempest deals 2 damage to everything on the board. Tempest is really important because it allows you to deal with cheese decks. Cheese decks are typically like combo decks where they're very razor thin in terms of their strategy, where sometimes a single cheap spell will just make the deck crumple, and then you win. Okay, so to talk here, really important to recognize the best commons you get for free, because these are the cards that you will play probably forever until they nerf them. And Saber Spine Tiger is definitely a card that is so good, I think it should probably be played in pretty much every deck. It's so versatile. When I covered the 4 types of cards, it happens to embody all of them. Essentially, a typical burn you would associate with spells, but giving rush to a minion basically turns it into a burn card. Essentially, you can think of Saber Spine Tiger as a slightly less flexible, because you can't hit anything. You can't just hit anything on the board, but you can think of it as basically a 3 mana Phoenix Spire, because you basically play it and then you toss it at something and it'll deal 3 damage to that something, either a general or a minion, etc. It typically you wouldn't associate it as a tempo card, but it can be if you buff it so it doesn't die, and then it can kill something and then still be on the board and threaten your opponent's life with it. Speaking of buffs, like, it works really well in combination with buff spells. Go figure. Saber Spine Tiger is a card that you can't react to necessarily. It you can't play around it exactly typically unless you're really far ahead. Like because if you try to play around specifically that card, then you're probably losing sometime typically, or you can't afford to compromise your position because if you do, then you'll lose anyways. Sometimes. What's the point? Yeah, Super Spine Tiger is really good. It implies the burn removal aspect of minion. It's basically a burn removal minion that works really well in combination with other cards, and can sometimes occasionally be tempo for some reason because it has 2 health. Primus Shieldmaster, I think, is probably the second best common. You won't literally play that in every deck until the end of time. This is one of those creatures that before they buffed it to 3 attack, when it had 2 attack, I still thought the card was really good. Technically, it was underwhelming to a lot of people, but at 3/6, with the ability Provoke, if you didn't know, Provoke makes it so then that minion has to be attacked. If a minion is surrounded by Provoke minions, you have to attack those minions. So you don't necessarily have to attack Shieldmaster, but if he's the only Provoke minion provoking that minion, they have to attack him. And that's what makes Primus Shieldmaster really powerful. Because he has a lot of health, he has a decent sized attack. Because your general has typically 2 attack unless you give him some modification through a minion or an artifact. So if you had to brute force your way through Primus Shieldmaster, you would deal 9 damage with Primus Shieldmaster without even having to do anything. And it would also require 3 attacks. That's what makes this card so powerful and effective, even against Vath, who has the Bloodborne spell where you can increase the general's attack. It would still take him at least 2 attacks typically to get rid of Primus Shieldmaster. That's why this card is so good. It's because it has a decent amount of attack, which will also kill a lot of small minions too. Keep that in mind. That's what makes it important. That's important to recognize. Yeah, it's a good card. And you have Healing Mystic. This is the most typical 2-drop you'll see in pretty much all starting decks, and you'll see it in control decks, sometimes in aggro decks or combo decks to sustain. It's just a really good 2-drop. It's 2/3 is the typical good 2-drop basically. Like when you build decks, you typically want either 2/3s with an okay effect like Healing Mystic, or occasionally you'll have like a 2/2 with an amazing effect, which I do mention one later in the slides. Or occasionally you might have a 2 mana with less than that, but the ability is insane. It's so good. But those are fairly far and few between. Typically your base decks, like your foundation 2-drops will be cards like Healing Mystic. Now you have Ephemeral Shroud, which basically is silence on a minion. It's good because, well, for 2 mana, silence is really good. There's no 2 mana destroy minion because that would be ridiculous. So this essentially is the 2 mana negate your minion's effect while providing a 2/2 body, which is really useful. So it creates tempo and acts as removal. It's pretty good. Repulsor Beast, however, is the 3 mana pseudo removal. Removal doesn't have to necessarily destroy. This is where Repulsor Beast proves it by essentially being the vanilla 3 mana, move any enemy minion into, move them anywhere you want. So sometimes you can move them closer to your minions to kill it. Sometimes you'll typically use it to move a minion in the middle of nowhere, like typically to another corner opposite of you. And for those like few turns where the minions basically been moved into a corner, essentially it's basically considered dead. You can almost think of it as dead. Like, it'll still have all its abilities, but for some minions, they might as well just have been dead and no longer relevant. So you can almost think of it as 3 mana, not destroy minion, but 3 mana, this minion no longer exists for a few turns. Blood Tier Alchemist, this card is really annoying. I think it's really propped up a lot in the past few months. Basically, people learned that ping is really, really valuable. Essentially, what you can think of this card almost like a 1 mana Phoenix Fire at best. But really, it's a 2/1, so it's an easy body to die. In fact, it dies to itself. You know, it's kind of funny that, yeah, it will die to itself. But it's so good because it's 1 mana. It's one of the 1 mana creatures you'll probably ever see being played really frequently, because its ability is just that useful. Being able to hit anything on the board for 1 damage is very useful. It's extremely annoying if you happen to try to float your minions with 1 health, because typically you want to maximize the value of your minions down to the last health, and Blood Tier Alchemist will just steal that health away and basically nullify some of the value that you would have gotten from your minion had it lived, if it didn't get pinged, you know. Now, out of the free stuff, now we look at the commons, basically your 40 dust commons. So for beginning players, like some of these cards will be probably some of the cards that are worth crafting immediately. Typically, it's never recommended to build too many commons, because commons are the lowest rarity and they're the easiest to pull. So you typically want to try to pull them. But honestly, some cards are so good that you basically want them right away so you can play your deck immediately, because sometimes, like, it really sucks to play a really gimped deck. Like the one I showed at this, I guess like halfway through this video or so, is not very good. I mean, it's playable. You can probably beat some people if you know what you're doing, but you will struggle against some decks that actually have cards. But when you add layers, when you start to add those layers, like once you start adding non-free commons, this is when it's like a game changer. Prime Assist is one of those game changers. The ability, give a nearby friendly minion +2 attack this turn, is really powerful. The ability to pump a nearby friendly minion by 2 attack is huge, because it allows you to trade up. As I was talking about, Primus Shieldmaster having like 6 health, like that's a lot of health, and to be honest, actually, there's probably not very many 2-drops that would get through it, unless, like, there are a few 2-drops that will get some bonus attack with their ability, and then on top of that, if you can pump it with a Prime Assist, then you can actually trade up and kill Primus Shieldmaster, which is huge, because Primus Shieldmaster is not a minion that typically just dies like that. Also, as you can see, because it has 3 health, it will die to 1 attack from Primus Shieldmaster. That was the whole point of, that was the whole importance of buffing its attack, because when it was at 2 attack, you could hit it with other 2-drops. Like that's why 2/3 was so important, because having 3 health meant that anything with 2 attack, including the general, would take 2 attacks to hit it. So the Primus Fist has really good stats and a really good ability. 10 out of 10 common. Definitely worth building. Shiro Puppy Dragon is one of the more recently released cards, and it's really strong as well. You'll probably typically see it in aggro or tempo decks. It's not a removal card, right? It's not a burn card, but what it does is something similar to Primus, where it gives your minions more value, basically. It increases the value of your minions by increasing their attack. End of turn. It's a very annoying card. They're like having a 2-drop with 4 health is very annoying to deal with, because as I talked about before with Blood Tier Alchemist, that 1 health difference is really significant. Because with a 2/3, you can hit it once, and then you can ping it with Blood Tier Alchemist. That's a very, very common play. And so a lot of 3 health minions will just die that way. Shiro requires you to straight up hit it twice with most things. Or sorry, more specifically, to trade against other 2-drops, you will have to hit it with a 2-drop at least twice, typically. The average 2-drop. Or if you're a general, you have to usually hit it twice. Which means the best thing is the fact that you will typically get at least 2 pumps, provided the minions are still alive, so you can pump them. You can also position Shiro in a way so then they can't get at it, and it just makes your minions bigger and bigger, more abominable. So yeah, it's a good comment. It's what I would define as a high threat minion, because it's a minion that generates passive advantage, where it generates passive advantage, so if you don't deal with it, it will eventually just run you over. It does have the caveat that it does kind of require other minions, but if you don't deal with it, and your opponent just sits there pumping their minions into oblivion, you might be screwed. Blistering Scorn is also another common that recently released, probably as early as almost like a week ago, basically. This card is so good that unless your deck revolves around running cards that don't like getting pinged, like, you probably should run this card. In terms of its stats, it has very ideal stats. A 3/4 for 3 is really good, though technically it's not a 4 health minion, because it deals damage to itself as well. It synergizes really well with certain spells, like in Magmar, the spell Amplification, which increases a minion's attack by 2 and health by 4, but it has to be damaged, so as a given, it works really well with that. The beauty of this card is that it's a gimmick killer, with a side of also killing a few generals that tend to lean towards making lots of little minions, little 1 health minions. So this card is a direct counter to those decks. So it has a solid body. That's the thing about 3-drops, is that typically they're mostly utility minions, as you noticed. Like, as you saw, Saberspine, stats wise, not so impressive, but because it has Rush, it's amazing. Absolutely ridiculous card. And Repulsor Beast, 2/2 stats, really mediocre, but the ability is fantastic. So like, Scorn is like a minion that kind of has a bit of both, where it has the decent body and a really good effect with it. It's a really worthwhile comment to make. It's definitely one of the comments that I would definitely make ASAP if you can. It's just too good. Dancing Blades is also a really good comment. It works in a lot of different decks. Like, even in some aggro decks, it can be typically the top end of your curve. And it's because of that ability. deal 3 damage to any minion in front of it. It can hit your minions too, so just make sure you don't do anything silly, like, kill your own stuff, by accident. But that ability is really good. As you noticed, and I talked about it a lot, the whole burn thing to deal 3 damage is really good. Like, Dancing Blades basically has a built-in Phoenix Fire that deals it only to the target in front of it. But who cares? You have a really well statted minion that basically Phoenix Fires whoever's in front of it. That's really good. That's really good value. Like, the cards you want to run are cards that are either extremely overstated or they just have like really good ability to stat ratio. So like they basically give you tons of value for what they are. Yeah. So yeah, as a given, like you'll see it in budget control decks. There are other better control cards at that cost typically, but this is just like a really solid all-rounder card. It's useful against like everything pretty much, for the most part. Like you will see this card, not all the time, but you'll see it often enough that you'll have to respect it. Like positioning well so you don't get dancing bladed is pretty important. Like it really sucks to get your minion dancing bladed and then get murdered by dancing blades. Now to go away from some staples to talk about just some really good commons. These commons kind of vary. Like sometimes they have some niche applications, but some of them are just really good. Or they have some really strong abilities that are really polarizing and can absolutely win you the match right off the bat sometimes. Jaxi is just one of those cards. If you read the ability, like when you or more importantly, look at the stats. It's a 1/1 for 2. And so you have to think, what kind of ability would it have that makes it so good? Making a 1-run ranged minion is pretty good. Mostly because of how it works. It's because it doesn't just make the minion just anywhere. It makes it in one of the 4 corners of the board. Which is really pretty significant because, like, depending on where it ends up on the board, sometimes your opponent can't get to it. Or maybe they can, but then they have to position themselves poorly to deal with it. It's a very annoying card. And the thing is, you don't want to proc it on your turn because you want to give your opponent less time to react to it. Like, you get them to pop it, so then you can use it you can use it the next turn, essentially. You can use it on your turn after their turn, which is typically how you start gaining values because, as I said before, ping is really good. So the ability to literally ping your opponent forever if they can't get to the corner is really powerful. This card used to be a 2/2, by the way. That was pretty annoying. As a 1/1, it's still annoying because that's how good the ability is. Ma is an example of a 2/2 for 2. This would be a card where if it had 3 health, it would be absolutely nuts. Everyone would play it. Literally, three copies in every deck, ever, of all time. But because it's 2/2, you actually have to think about it a little. And its effect is really good. It's good enough to be debatable to be placed in a lot of decks, depending on what you're trying to do. You'll typically see it in aggro decks, and you'll typically see them in some control decks. Some control decks that don't have like natural good answers around the 2 and the 3 mana cost. And it's good because, typically you'll use it to kill their 2-drop or something, and it generates tempo. It's kind of like that Repulsor Beast thing where, you deal with the problem and you generate tempo. Having a minion on the board is pretty valuable, so. First Sword of Akron is pretty good. It's better than Stone Steel Golem or whatever that 6-drop is called. It Has one less health, one less attack for an ability that is pretty game changing when you think about it. Giving all other minions you own, plus one attack while he's on the board allows you to trade up. Again, it's like that, Prime Assist thing in the Shiro. Getting extra attack, really good. So, like, having this permanent aura that gives all your stuff plus one attack, really good. So, like, you could use it as the top end of your aggro decks. I don't think you necessarily see it in, like, mid-range that much, because there's usually better mid-range cards. Typically, factions have better options around the 5 and the 6 that would rather play those than Akron. But again, Akron's a common. Those cards typically are like rares or higher. So, Silhouette Tracer. This is more important for certain decks, but for others, it's just like, I don't know, like for 2/6, it's kind of like whatever. But its ability is pretty useful. Allows you to run away. Allows you to chase people sometimes. So if you play artifacts, it allows you to get in their face, to use your equipment to beat up the enemy general. And yeah, I don't know. It's 6 health minion with 2 attack. It's useful still. Now you have some cards that are kind of similar, but those slight differences can make a difference depending on what you're trying to do. Personally, I prefer cards like Blaze Hound or Void Hunter because the 1 health difference. Because like compared to another card that I mentioned earlier, cards like Maw would just kill your Void Hunter for free, but it wouldn't kill Blaze Hound for free, which is important. Even though Blaze Hound would still die to a swing and a ping, but you still get the 4 damage though. That's what makes it important. But then again, right? If you compare them, one also that's important too. Actually, it's the fact that Blaze Hound gives both players a card, but it also gives you the cards immediately. So being able to draw cards and use them immediately is pretty important. It also makes it so that your opponent can't silence it, so then you don't get any value out of it. That is important. In Void Hunter, yeah, like it's basically a burn something for 4, draw a card if you can get your ideal target. Other interesting 3-drops. Again, 3-drops are not typically impressive in the stats. Your stat changes typically are around the 2 costs, or they're around the evens. Usually when the stats start to change significantly between costs. So like Sapphire Seer is an interesting card because it's a 3 mana 2/2 force field. Like force field is an absolutely ridiculous ability because force field absorbs the first damage that minion would take. So that it would absorb 1 damage or it would absorb 1 billion damage. Doesn't matter. As long as it's the first damage that it would take, it would negate it. That makes it really powerful. Then you have cards like Sunseer. It's like Sunseer is kind of like just a big 2-drop because it's 2/4. And its ability is kind of interesting, I guess. You gain 4. You basically will typically gain like between 2 to 4 life off of it. I don't know why someone would silence it because it's not that good, but you can think of it as like a big healing mystic that'll give you a bit of extra life. You can't heal minions with Sunseer, but I mean like your general will probably get like a bit of a boost from it. Important distinction between these 2 cards as well. You will typically see these in like budget or actual control decks and some mid ranges, depending on the class, or I mean I guess on the faction. Frostbone Naga is 3/3/4, so pretty underwhelming stats, but the ability is pretty good. Hitting everything around it for 2 damage, including generals, so you can think of it as kind of like a burn card. But more importantly, it does 2 damage AoE, which is pretty useful. Like, it helps you deal with swarm decks, typically. Then you have Death Blighter, which is a 3/4 for 6, and that is incredibly underwhelming stats. Luckily, the ability is you deal 3 damage to all enemy minions around it. So unlike Frostbow Naga, which hits all minions, all generals, so it would hit you as well. So Frostbow Naga could kill you if you played it. But Death Blighter won't kill you. It will deal 3 damage to all the enemies, which sometimes is enough. If you're playing against an equal costed minion, typically Death Blighter will not kill it. Like, Death Blighter will probably not kill another 6-drop. But it will help you kill pretty much like any 2-drop, a lot of 3-drops, a couple 4-drops, a really specific few 5-drops, or at least do them a lot of damage, so then you can finish them off with something like Scorn or something. Like, this is an example of like a fleshed out deck. It does use a couple cards that I didn't mention. I was mostly using Archetypes as an example because you do start with it. Some of these cards you do start with, for example, like Windblade Adept. It's the guy with the sword beside the Blaze Hound. He's a 2/3 with Zeal. Zeal is if this minion is beside the general, you get the ability. So his ability is +2 attack. So basically, when he's beside your general, he's a 4/3, which is basically like being a 3-drop for 2 mana. Yeah, like when you look at this deck is really cheap to build and is really effective. I've been playing it for fun. I do have a couple legends and epics, and I've built better decks, but it's something I've tried. It's pretty funny to use only commons as a challenge. And it's also proof that like commons are pretty effective. It just comes down to the player. Sometimes you will get outvalued. It's like I'm not gonna say that you can beat literally anyone with this deck, but like you will beat a decent amount of people with good play. And I built this, using the principles that I talked about in this video. I wanted to build Tempo Archeon. Tempo Archeon typically is like a 6/2 the 9k spirit deck. And I essentially built something that was like a fraction of the cost. And it definitely is not as good as a true Tempo Archeon deck, but it definitely has a similar feel and spirit. So, as you can see, I played a lot of the cards I mentioned. Cards like First Sword of Akron works well with your really aggressive curve. There are like, how many 2-drops in this deck? 9. So, and keep in mind too, you don't have to craft all these cards. You can play substitutes for them. Like if you look at the base deck that I mentioned much earlier in the video, essentially this deck is like an evolution of that deck. So like, let's say you don't have Azurite Lines. Azurite Line's pretty good. I'm not gonna lie. You could try to play without it and kind of isn't as good. You can play Healing Mystic instead of it, and wouldn't be too sad because Healing Mystic does add its own kind of value. But Azurite Line is better. It's just if you're willing to pay to make it. But I'm gonna say that like you probably should make cards like Prime Assist though, because Prime Assist is very good. The Blaze Hand is just the only one I had, so I just played it. No particular reason. It's just an overall good 3-drop. Your 3-drops are, again, they're utility. They're typically utility cards, so like you can see there's 3 Repulsor Beasts in this deck, 3 Saber Spines. Saber Spine works really well with Archeon because his Bloodborne spell is Roar, which gives 2 attack to a nearby minion. It's not Zeal, by the way, so you can give them the attack and then move away, which is a huge benefit. So you will use it in conjunction with cards like Saber Spine Tiger to finish out games. Silverguard Knight is a card that was shown earlier. It's basically a 3/5 when it's near your general. So it's probably, at least in my opinion, one of the best free commons you can ever get. Ever. Because it's essentially 1 health. Like, as long as it's near your general, it's basically 1 health off of Primus, with a slight offset of the fact that it's weak to silence. But otherwise, it's basically like 80% of a Primus for like a fraction of the cost, so that's pretty good. This deck runs Suntide Maiden. Suntide Maiden is another really good common for Archeon. Simply because you can just keep upping its attack. And its ability is Zeal regenerate its health at the end of your turn. So you can use it to swing, you can use it to hit something, and provided it doesn't die, it will heal it all back up. Which makes it also a fairly high threat. People will try to kill it fast, because if you don't kill it, it will just keep dealing damage to you and healing itself. Very annoying card. You want to kill it. And yeah, then you see a lot of the other commons I mentioned, like Dancing Blades. It's just good. It's just a good 5-drop. 5-drops are kind of weird. There's just like the really good 5-drops. A lot of them are like epics and legendaries. I'll talk about those in another video. But for now, it's basically like Dancing Blades are some of the best. Is some of the best like 120 spirit you can ever spend, probably. You can play it in a lot of stuff. It's good. And so instead of playing cards like Ephemeral Shroud, though, Lionar has access to a spell called Sunbloom. Sunbloom will dispel a 2x2 square. So you're trading the body for the ability to silence multiple cards, and it also has the added benefit of not being targeting. So there are a few minions that you cannot target that I won't get into, but having the ability to target those minions to get rid of their abilities is a huge plus of this card. And then yeah, so there is a pattern with this deck too. You either have a bunch of value minions or a lot of high health value minions, and it happens to work really well with Divine Bond. So it works on the same principle as the original deck, but basically by spending, or maybe like getting some of those cards through the first couple packs that you start with, for basically a really small dust amount, you make a deck that's exponentially better than the free deck. This is a really good value for what you get. You can increase your win rate quite a bit more if you had more expensive cards, but like that's the whole idea. Is like this is where the beauty of deck construction comes from. The ability to build with what you have, to build within restraints. It's fun. It's how you learn to be a good deck builder without having to rely on sites like Mana Ranks or Reddit. You know, flexing your creativity. Well, to be fair, I guess this isn't really that creative of a deck, but by following those principles, at least you'll be able to build your own decks, presumably with different classes. Like I'm not gonna build. I've built them using those principles, but I'm not gonna cover them in this video. It will come down to you being able to discover how to build other classes with what you have. And yeah, that's pretty much it.